History as it happens, April 21st, 2022. The problem of war crimes.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
The Nuremberg Trials, 3/4 of a century ago, set a standard for international justice, showing that the leaders of a powerful country could be held accountable for trampling human rights in a war of aggression. Today, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is provoking calls for a war crimes investigation and allegations of genocide from the U.S. president. But don't expect another Nuremberg. The odds are against anyone being brought to justice. And we'll explain why next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
None of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits genocide half a world away.
It is a difficult issue because it's a very sensitive issue and there's a legal definition which plays out in courtrooms, and then there is a more political uses of the word. And as a legal matter, Rwanda was found to be a genocide. Of course, people agree that the Holocaust was a genocide, though the term was not invented till after the war.
On July 26, 1946, the chief U.S. prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal delivered his closing argument. Justice Robert Jackson said the accused, 24 Nazi leaders, conspired to commit crimes against peace, also known as a war of aggression, crimes against humanity, and violations of the laws of war.
A glance over the dock will show that despite their quarrels among themselves, each defendant played a part which fitted in with every other, and all advanced the common plan. It contradicts experience that men of such diverse backgrounds and talents should so forward each other's aims by coincidence. The large and varied role of Goering was half militarist and half gangster. He stuck a pudgy finger in every pie. He used his SA muscle men to help bring the gang into power.
We're so used to hearing such terms as crimes against humanity that it's easy to forget how novel were the Nuremberg Trials. For the first time in history, an international tribunal sought to punish individuals for violating basic human rights by waging a war of aggression or murdering or mistreating prisoners and civilians in occupied countries.
When we put all of their stories together, this is the ridiculous composite picture of Hitler's government that emerges. It was composed of a number 2 man who knew nothing of the excesses of the Gestapo which he created. A number 3 man who was merely an innocent middleman transmitting Hitler's orders without even reading them, like a postman or a delivery boy.
About a year after the trial began, 3 defendants were acquitted. 4 got 10 to 20 years in prison, 3 got life, and 10 were sentenced to death. They were hanged on October 16, 1946. Hermann Goering escaped the hangman by swallowing poison before he could be executed. But in the 76 years since Nuremberg, war crimes cases have proven difficult to prosecute and convictions are relatively rare. The International Criminal Court, which began its work in 2002, has indicted about 40 people in all from Africa. As Max Fisher wrote in the New York Times a couple of days ago, justice for war crimes has usually been applied by conquerors or victors in a civil war. Remember, the reason why so many top Nazis were captured was the Allies occupied Germany after defeating the Wehrmacht. There's really no chance a foreign army is going to invade Russia and haul off Vladimir Putin and his ruling clique for what's going on in Ukraine. Not sure how Putin would ever even wind up in The Hague. But in the meantime, we have mounting evidence of atrocities. Executed Ukrainian civilians and residential neighborhoods with no military targets reduced to rubble. Russia's war is a war of aggression in moral, if not strict legal terms. Alex Whiting is an expert on international war crimes law, a former prosecutor at the ICC. His current post is deputy prosecutor at the Kosovo Specialist Prosecutor's Office. Alex Whiting, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us from The Hague, where, as mentioned, you're the deputy prosecutor for the Kosovo Specialist Prosecutor's Office. That is from the late 1990s, that war. So I guess that's an indication of the difficulties we're working with here, right? These cases take a long time to come to fruition and to prosecute.
That's right, Martin. These investigations can take a long time because, for many different reasons, sometimes investigators don't have access to the crime scene. Sometimes it takes a long time for the political will to set up a court. Sometimes it takes a long time to arrest fugitives. Omar al-Bashir, for example, was charged by the International Criminal Court in 2009, and he remains a fugitive today, though could be surrendered even this year by Sudan to the ICC. So there are many reasons for prolonged proceedings.
As a war crimes prosecutor, I'm just interested to learn what you've been thinking about as you've been watching the war in Ukraine unfold from a distance, now with allegations of war crimes and evidence of massacres of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following it closely, of course, and I suppose my reactions are first, of course, to think about the victims and the devastation that has caused, the loss of life, the loss of cities. You know, I've dealt over the many years that I've been doing this work, I've dealt with many victims and survivors. I know the devastation that occurs in these wars. And then, of course, my mind also goes immediately into thinking about, do these constitute crimes? What's the evidence? And if I were an investigator or prosecutor working on the Ukraine case right now, what would be my first steps? What would I do? Where would I look? What kind of evidence would I gather? So I immediately go into investigation prosecution mode when I look at the images.
Because it's difficult. You just can't take a newspaper article or some video footage and say, here, open and shut case, right? I mean, even during the Holocaust, and we'll get to the Nuremberg Trials, that was an issue.
Yeah, that's a really important point because oftentimes these courts get set up or these investigations get started in a context where it appears like there are clear perpetrators and victims and clear war crimes. And there may be truth to that, but to prove these cases in a court of law, and in particular a criminal court of law, requires evidence that is reliable, authenticated, and evidence that meets the beyond a reasonable doubt test, because what you're doing is prosecuting an individual for these crimes and with the potentially the ultimate outcome of putting that person in prison. And so you do have to go beyond the images and the newspaper reporting. You have to interview witnesses, gather physical and forensic evidence. Sometimes the crimes are very straightforward to prove. For example, I think the apparent crimes in Bucha of civilians being executed, those look like pretty clear-cut crimes. And other times, it's more difficult to prove, even if it looks like a crime.
And my reference to the Nuremberg Trials and the Holocaust, I want to just clarify what I meant there. It's not so much proving that it happened. It's, so who's culpable now? Because we're talking about an enormous crime in that case. And even now in Russia and Ukraine, we can see what's happening. Well, who's culpable? So my next question, and maybe you can help me navigate this. I mean, when it comes to war, it is kind of a strange moral space. You can argue that the entire war in Ukraine is a crime committed by Russia because it was an unprovoked war of aggression. But if Russian soldiers are in combat with Ukrainian soldiers and they kill them, or if Russian warplanes drop bombs on legitimate military targets, I think a lot of people would say that's not a war crime. But your reference to Bucha, if Russian soldiers massacre civilians, well, that's a different story. But who's to blame for that? Individual soldiers acting on their own initiative, commanding officers, Vladimir Putin himself. Who gets dragged before the court?
Right. So to the first part of your question, what's really important to understand here is that there are actually two bodies of law that apply. The first applies to the question of whether the war itself is legal or illegal. And if it's illegal, it could amount to the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression was the central crime at Nuremberg. It was the motivating crime. War crimes and crimes against humanity were also prosecuted, but the supreme crime was the crime of aggression. But no international tribunal since Nuremberg has prosecuted that crime. And we can talk about whether that might be prosecuted here in the Ukraine case.
I did not know that was the only time.
Yeah, and we can get into that in more detail. The second body of law that applies is with respect to war crimes and crimes against humanity or genocide. And for those questions, it doesn't matter who started the war or whether it was a legal war or an illegal war. That body of law sets those questions aside and says, okay, now we have a war. Who cares who started it? That's not important right now. Now we have a war, and there are rules that apply in warfare. And if you violate those rules intentionally, and it's a serious rule, that can be a crime. So targeting civilians, abusing prisoners, those can be crimes in warfare. And then to the second part of your question, well, who gets held responsible for the war crimes or crimes against humanity? That is typically the central challenge for war crime investigators. The first step is to establish that a crime occurred. As I said, sometimes that's relatively straightforward to the extent anything is in this world. Other times that can be more challenging. In a targeting case, for example, that can be more challenging. But then the second step is to establish who is responsible. We typically call that linkage evidence, linking the crime with the person who is the most senior responsible military or civilian official. That's the hard part.
Because you can't indict an entire army, or maybe you can. You can't indict every citizen in a country. I've read a lot of Holocaust scholarship, and this issue comes up quite a bit. The level of complicity among ordinary Germans versus the perpetrators of the Holocaust itself, the highest-ranking Nazis from Hitler, Himmler, on the way down. So there are different levels of culpability, and not being an expert in the field, not being a lawyer, this is difficult for me to navigate, wondering, in the case of Ukraine and Russia, who might get brought before the ICC. Theoretically, we know that Vladimir Putin is not going to ever show up before the ICC. That could be our next subject to discuss here. Why is it so difficult to get people before the court? Only about 40 people have been indicted since 2002 when the ICC was formed.
The ICC, because it has a broad mandate and limited resources, and it wants to maximize its impact, it will always try to charge senior officials. Sometimes it'll charge more mid-level people if it's trying to build a case up, trying to work their way up the chain of command, or if it's a particularly notorious crime. But really the goal is to charge the most senior people. And it's difficult to get the evidence, first of all, because those senior people are far away from where the crimes are committed. And there is almost never a smoking gun order that is issued from the president or the senior general to commit the crimes. That's just not how it happens. The instructions or the preparations or the planning to commit these crimes at a senior level is done in much more coded language and a much more secretive way. So penetrating that and getting the evidence to show that the senior person is in fact encouraging, directing, planning, facilitating, assisting these crimes, that's hard to prove. And then once you charge the person, getting them to The Hague is a whole separate challenge because, as you alluded to, Russia is not a member of the court. It has no legal obligation to turn those people over and obviously would not. So getting them to be surrendered or finding a way to arrest them is difficult.
The United States is not party to the court either. That's a problem,
Correct.
Isn't it?
Well, in this case, it's a problem in the sense it doesn't create any jurisdictional problems or problems with respect to arrests or anything like that. It's only a problem to the extent the U.S. wants to help with the investigation, which the administration has indicated that it is looking for ways to assist. There's a discussion going on in Washington now, beyond the administration in Congress, about whether the U.S. should adjust its position with respect to the ICC so that it can provide more assistance in these sorts of cases. I don't think we're going to see the U.S. joining the ICC, but I do think that there may be a shift in policy that it would allow it to be more involved, provide more assistance.
I suppose the problem with the ICC is in its nature of its mission. You correct me if I'm wrong. The reason we're trying to deal with these at the international level, as opposed to within individual nations, is to have impartial justice that's not victor's justice. Because, as we know, crimes that are committed in war are often prosecuted within countries. For instance, an American soldier or an American officer does something terrible in a village somewhere. They are often prosecuted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice in the United States. But the ICC has a larger purpose, right? And you wrote in an article some years ago when the ICC had been changing over, I guess, from its second prosecutor to its third. I'll read right from the article you wrote in this journal. There exist problems of institutional design. Why don't you explain that?
Right. So one thing that's important about the ICC is that it's actually designed to be a backstop to national jurisdictions doing these cases themselves, because that is always preferable for many reasons. The thought is that nations will reconcile and deal with these better if they do them themselves rather than having it done in The Hague. And also for resource reasons. The ICC has relatively limited resources, so it always seeks to encourage states to do the cases themselves. It's only if they are unable or they refuse to do the case that the ICC will step in. And it is also, it has the added advantage, as you say, of providing international, hopefully impartial justice. The difficulty, the challenge that the ICC faces is that it is, as an international court, it does not have compulsory legal authority in states. It relies on the cooperation of states. And so you get into a little bit of a pickle because the ICC gets jurisdiction when the state is unable or unwilling to prosecute the case themselves. But in order for the ICC to succeed, it often needs to rely on cooperation from that very same state.
Well, I think most of us assume that Russia is not going to prosecute its own army. I mean, I don't know, but I think it looks like a long shot that Russia is going to handle this. Therein lies the problem.
That's right. So I don't think anybody expects, certainly based on the rhetoric and statements from the government so far, anybody expects the Russian government to turn around and start investigating and prosecuting these apparent war crimes. And so the ICC has jurisdiction. It is conducting a pretty intense investigation right now. It may, in a matter of months even, start to bring charges. And then there will be a question of whether individuals can be arrested. And I would say there are two important things about that question, whether people can be arrested. The first is the ICC's investigation serves very important purposes even before anybody gets arrested. Both the fact of the investigation and the bringing of charges sends important signals and records important facts for history.
You're recording a record of what happened.
Correct. And also signaling to the victims that the crimes are seen and signaling to the perpetrators, the current perpetrators and future perpetrators, that they're being watched. The second thing is that we sit here and we say, we're sitting here saying, and quite reasonably, that it seems unlikely that Russians will be brought to The Hague or that Putin would ever be brought to The Hague. But nobody ever thought that Slobodan Milosevic would ever be brought to The Hague. Nobody thought that Charles Taylor would be brought to The Hague. At Nuremberg, none of the accused at Nuremberg ever thought that they would be sitting in a courtroom and being judged. The politics of the world have a way of spinning sometimes, not always, it's no guarantee, but spinning sometimes to create opportunities for arrests or for surrenders. So, for example, if the government in Russia changed and the new government decided it was in its interest to surrender the accused, it's possible that it could happen.
So when we were preparing to talk, I sent you a piece from the New York Times by Max Fisher, where he cited that figure I mentioned before. Only 40 people have been indicted since 2002, when the ICC was formed by the Rome Statute. And he says they're all from Africa, typically a deposed dictator or a warlord, the loser in a civil war, meaning that the winners of some of these conflicts, who have also committed atrocities, are never brought to justice. Is it fair to say that the ICC simply has not worked out when it comes to adjudicating conflicts across the world if the only people being indicted are from Africa?
Well, I think it's too soon to come to that conclusion about the ICC. It is true that the ICC in its beginning years focused on cases in Africa, largely because the countries in Africa at issue invited the ICC, asked the ICC to come. And in other cases, because the Security Council, for example, in Sudan and Libya, referred the case to the ICC. There are relatively few cases where the ICC itself, on its own initiative, chose to open up an investigation in Africa. Okay. But in the last 5 or 10 years or so, the ICC has broadened its scope of investigations. It's now investigating in Georgia and has proposed arrest warrants in Georgia, Philippines, Venezuela, and now, of course, in Ukraine. So it has branched out. The ICC is a relatively young institution. It's only been operating for 20 years. And in the creation of a judicial system, particularly on an international scale, that's a blink of an eye, 20 years. And so, yes, it is incomplete. It does not have universal jurisdiction around the world. There are 123 states that are members, a number of important states like the US and Russia and China, India, that are not members. And so it is a project that is in creation. It is imperfect, it's incomplete, but it is achieving results and it's building on those achievements.
Well, thank you for that context and perspective, because the theme or the headline of that piece I shared with you was, don't expect much out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict given the track record, but maybe we will see something come of it. President Biden said what is going on in Ukraine is genocide. So I looked up Raphael Lemkin, who coined that term, a World War II era term. Here's the language from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children from the group to another group. So that last piece there, that has been alleged in Ukraine. So technically it fits the definition of genocide, or does it not?
There's a lot of discussion about that right now, and I think most commentators think that it's too early, it's premature to make a judgment that the crime of genocide applies. The crime of genocide as a legal matter is a very narrow crime with a very specific intent requirement. As you read out, what is critical, what is central to the crime of genocide is an intent to destroy in whole or in part. And then there are a number of acts which can contribute to that intent. For example, it is a war crime to target civilians during armed conflict or to abuse them or to abuse prisoners of war. Even if that occurs on a wide scale, large scale, that doesn't amount without more to genocide. So the genocide is a potent political concept, and it is often deployed, and victims experience what these horrific crimes as a genocide, because that is what it feels like to them. But it's complicated as a legal matter because of this very specific intent notion. I think we have to approach it with care.
Yeah, I don't like to quibble over definitions sometimes when we're dealing with mass death, right? Mass misery. But there is a legal definition to this. I think most sane people agree the Holocaust during World War II, the Shoah, was genocide. There is still dispute over whether the Armenian Genocide, which I consider a genocide based on my reading of history, but I'm no expert. I believe the Armenian Genocide in World War I was a genocide. What happened in Rwanda in the 1990s seems to have been a genocide. But there's not too many other situations that might fit into that definition. U.S. history, was the treatment of Native Americans a genocide? I'm not necessarily asking you to answer that question now, but the issue, right? The issue. This is a difficult issue.
It is a difficult issue because it's a very sensitive issue, and there's a legal definition which plays out in courtrooms, and then there is a more political uses of the word. And as a legal matter, Rwanda was found to be a genocide. Of course, people agree that the Holocaust was a genocide, though the term was not invented till after the war.
That's right. Came about as a result of that.
Correct. And the execution of some 8,000 men and boys at Srebrenica in July of 1995 has also been found by a court to be a genocide. But there are numerous other atrocities which, on their scale, feel like they could be a genocide, but they don't necessarily meet the technical definition.
And if they don't meet that technical definition, that doesn't really minimize how horrendous they were.
Right. And they would typically, in almost all cases, meet the definition of crimes against humanity or war crimes, which are, of course, also very, very serious crimes. And I think in this world, we have to be careful not to create a hierarchy of atrocity crimes so that, well, if it's not a genocide, it doesn't really count, because we have these other very serious crimes against humanity and war crimes, which cover those other situations.
Agreed. As I mentioned before, sometimes I try to avoid quibbling over definitions, although definitions are important. So let's talk a little about Nuremberg. I mean, as you decided to pursue this vocation as a prosecutor of war crimes, did Nuremberg influence you? I mean, how important is what happened there to you and your mindset?
Nuremberg is central to this project because it was the first international prosecution for these kinds of crimes. So it broke the ground. It really was the invention, the creation. And as we know, the prosecutions were in some ways imperfect, but what was important was that it set a precedent. And that's what I think is so important about these cases. And this goes back to your question earlier about, well, it's incomplete and it doesn't cover the whole world, and we haven't been able to always prosecute both sides or the senior people. But each investigation, each prosecution is a precedent for the future that makes it harder for perpetrators to commit these crimes in the future, and makes it a little bit easier for victims to demand justice, because they can now say, well, the world found a way to bring justice in Nuremberg, to bring justice in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia, hopefully in Ukraine. And as those precedents pile up, it creates a kind of pressure on the future, a kind of imperative to continue to bring justice in future cases. So Nuremberg was the first precedent, and it was the building block that led to the creation of all these other tribunals and, of course, the International Criminal Court.
To your point about prosecutions being incomplete, I mean, there's no way to get everybody, in the case of the Holocaust, for instance, the enormity of that crime and the number of people who participated in it, perpetrated it, or were further down the ladder of culpability, if you will, were simply complicit in it. We were dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of people. At the International Military Tribunal, which was the official name, they had to make some difficult decisions, right, about who they could try and for what.
Yeah, that's right. So the definitions in law of who can be held responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide are very broad. The law reaches anybody who directs, plans, participates, aids and abets. If you're a commander, you fail to punish or prevent. The law is written with a very broad scope to capture all of those different potential participants. And as you rightly noted, these crimes, these mass atrocities do not occur at the hands of a few people. They require the work of many, many people contributing. However, it's just not practical to prosecute and try hundreds or thousands of people. And so that's why we try to prosecute the most senior people, because that has the most impact. And some of the more notorious individuals, particularly on the international level, domestic courts will sometimes prosecute more broadly and target direct perpetrators. But then we have to also remember that prosecution is one form of accountability. It's not the only thing that happens after mass atrocity. And so there can be other consequences for people who may have participated. Maybe they lose their jobs. Maybe they're singled out, or victims get reparations. There can be other mechanisms, truth mechanisms, that can address some of the harms caused by the broader group.
Well, that's right. At Nuremberg, one of the aims was to take the documentary record and show it to the German people so they could not deny, although many of them did, what had happened, what was perpetrated by their country. It took some time for Germans to come to terms, and they've been a model as a nation, right, coming to terms with the horrors of their past. But not right away. That process had to start somewhere, and it started at Nuremberg.
Right. One of the ambitions of criminal prosecutions for these crimes is, as you said, to establish a record with reliable evidence, tested in a court of law, facts to a high standard of proof that then contributes to establishing those facts for history. It's not an exercise of history writing. That's not the purpose, but it has the effect of contributing to history. And that's a really important point, because the hope is that that can contribute to breaking the cycle of violence. If you establish individual responsibility for the crimes, then it's not group responsibility. It's not a nation. The idea is that you hope to break the resentments that could cause violence or conflict in the future. Right. By individualizing the crimes and establishing the facts in a clear record.
Because immediately after World War II, many Germans did not want to admit, and many actively denied, that they had ever actively or passively supported Hitler and the Nazis. So it was important to establish those facts. Another important precedent from Nuremberg: due process, even for the worst SOBs in human history, right? Controversial at the time.
That was controversial. Before a decision was made to establish the court, there was serious consideration to simply executing the Nazi leaders once they were captured and their identity was established. But the idea of having a process and giving them due process prevailed. And this has given birth to the notion of having an international tribunal and presenting the facts and allowing them to defend themselves. That is important for establishing the record, for the credibility of the determination, for the future, so that it's harder to contest those facts in the future.
I want to return to current day, but one more question about Nuremberg. Is it true that in the first decade after the trials, that many people look back on it and thought it was a failure because so many people who had been Nazis were able to rehabilitate themselves because, well, Germany needed capable people to run the post-war country and its recovery, and many people, judges, including judges who had been members of the Nazi Party, were able to get jobs and have normal lives again?
Yeah, that's right. And today we look back on Nuremberg as being an incredible moment of creation and in many ways an enormous success, with qualifications, because there were certain things that were missing in terms of the process and so forth. But overall, quite a successful moment. But it took time for that opinion to reach that view. And after Nuremberg, there was cynicism about what the process was and what it accomplished. There was discontent that it didn't necessarily reach more people. That is a reality of these tribunals. And as I said before, the process of adjusting and reconciling and repairing after conflict and after mass atrocity is complex. And prosecution is one part of it, but just one little part of it. And there is a broader mission there to try to rehabilitate and try to get back on track and reconcile.
These really are enormous issues, and I'm glad that you've been explaining them, because it is easy, especially from where I'm sitting here in a studio in Washington, to say, well, the ICC isn't very effective. Back to current day, even if no Russians are ever successfully prosecuted for what's going on in Ukraine, are you confident that the ICC or whoever will be able to establish a record of what's going on there for the world to see?
Well, it will certainly be able to contribute to that task. Obviously, if there's not a trial, then the evidence can't be presented and tested and a judgment isn't written. And that is a loss. That is an enormous loss. And doing an investigation and charging individuals only takes you so far. However, the process of investigating for a criminal case is different, is very particular. It's not writing a newspaper article. It's not writing a report. It is gathering evidence that you hope will one day be presented in a court of law. So from the start, ensures that the evidence is gathered in a reliable, methodical, careful way. And if that evidence isn't used for a trial, ultimately, it's available for other purposes, including establishing the record.
There are outside political considerations here. The foreign policy realists would say that at some point, there's going to have to be a resumption of dialogue between the West and Russia. Turning Russia into a pariah state doesn't serve pragmatic purposes. It's just too large a country, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin is a ghastly tyrant. Russia's too large geographically. It has too much oil, too much gas, and too much military power to leave it on the outside of the international community. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that everybody should be hoping that there is some path to peace, and a path that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and what's happened to it, but that there is some path forward that allows for reconciliation or peace, let's say, if it's not reconciliation, because nobody wants to have a conflict go on forever. And as you say, having Russia be a pariah state is not really in anybody's interest. This sort of touches on a question in this world that has existed from the beginning, which is peace versus justice. And is there a conflict between the aims of the two? And do justice aims could they ever get in the way of achieving peace or some sort of reconciliation or end of the conflict? In the early years, there was an anxiety that was a problem with trying to pursue justice, particularly while the conflict was ongoing. However, more and more, I think people have come to believe that both aims can be achieved, that you can't have peace without justice, you can't have justice without peace, you need to achieve both. And diplomats when there has been an insistence on justice, diplomats have found ways to adjust around that and take that reality into account when achieving some kind of resolution to the conflict.
It gives me some hope here in this case is that ordinary Ukrainians and ordinary Russians, regardless of which side of the border they lived on, did not hate each other.
Well, yeah, I think that one thing that you see over and over again with these atrocities is that, at least this is my belief, is that it's not innate in any nation or people, a group of people, to go commit crimes against others and commit these atrocities. It's directed from the top. It's not that they're forced to do it, and there are many cases where they have choices, and they could say they make the wrong choices. But the point is that the atmosphere, the climate that is created that causes people to decide to turn on their neighbors, turn on their fellow human beings, and commit crimes like we're seeing in, that appear to be being committed in Ukraine. That climate, that atmosphere, that ideology, that propaganda is always directed from the top. It always comes from senior people who are exploiting the situation, causing fear, making the population feel like that there's an existential threat, that if
they have to hate each other,
that if they don't commit the crimes against the others, that the crimes will be committed against them. That is also why the international tribunals always try to hold responsible those senior people, because there are always senior people behind these atrocities.
Alex Whiting, we thank you for joining us from The Hague and for enlightening us on this very difficult issue. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Vladimir the Historian. One of our favorite topics here is examining the ways history is used and abused. We're going to speak to an expert on Ukrainian history about how Vladimir Putin distorts the past to justify his war. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.